Welcome to Silent Screams, where the line between festive joy and creeping fear becomes razor thin. Tonight, we delve into 3 terrifying Thanksgiving nightmares. This isn't your average holiday cheer. These are tales where laughter turns to screams, and the warmth of family gatherings fades into the cold grip of terror. So, pull your chair a little closer, dim the lights, and prepare yourself for a holiday you'll never forget. Let's begin. It started with a house full of guests, laughter echoing in the air, and the smell of roasted turkey wafting through the halls. Clara had always prided herself on hosting the perfect Thanksgiving. Her family would gather in her sprawling, old farmhouse every year, the creaky wooden floors groaning under the weight of footsteps and the steady hum of chatter. But this year, something was different. The air felt heavy, charged, as though the house itself was holding its breath. As the family sat down for dinner, passing dishes and sharing stories, Clara noticed a strange flicker in the corner of her eye. She turned her head slightly and froze. A figure stood just beyond the dining room doorway, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and shadowy, its form indistinct, but its presence was undeniable. Clara blinked, and it was gone. She tried to shake the feeling, chalking it up to exhaustion from the day's preparations. But as the night wore on, the house seemed to come alive. Lights flickered inexplicably, and the old grandfather clock in the hallway began to chime, though it hadn't worked in years. At first, no one noticed the small, unsettling details. But then Clara's young niece, Sophie, pointed to the empty chair at the end of the table and whispered, "Who's that man sitting there?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look, but the chair was empty. Clara's heart pounded as she gently asked Sophie what she had seen. "He's tall," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "And he's smiling at us." Across town, another family was experiencing a Thanksgiving they would never forget. Jake and his wife, Amanda, had decided to drive to Amanda's parents' house for the holiday. The road was long and winding, cutting through miles of dense forest. They left later than planned, and by the time they were halfway there, night had fallen and a thick fog had rolled in, obscuring their path. As Jake drove cautiously, the headlights illuminating only a few feet ahead, Amanda gasped. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake glanced at her, confused. "I thought I saw someone standing by the road," she said, staring out into the fog. Jake shook his head. "It's probably just a tree or a shadow," he said, trying to sound reassuring. But moments later, the car's radio crackled to life, emitting a burst of static that made them both jump. They hadn't touched the dial, and the radio had been off since they started the drive. Over the static, a faint voice could be heard, whispering something they couldn't quite make out. Jake turned the radio off, but the unease lingered. A few miles later, they saw it. A figure in the middle of the road. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. The figure didn't move, illuminated in the glow of the headlights. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. He was tall and dressed in tattered clothes, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His face was obscured by shadows, but Amanda swore she saw a grin, a wide, unnatural grin. Before they could react, the figure disappeared. Jake and Amanda sat in stunned silence, their breaths visible in the chilly air inside the car. "We're turning around," Jake said finally, his voice firm. But as he shifted the car into reverse, the fog grew thicker, swallowing the road behind them. It was as if the path they had traveled no longer existed. Back in the small, quiet town, another story was unfolding. An elderly woman named Evelyn was spending Thanksgiving alone for the first time. Her husband had passed earlier that year, and her children were scattered across the country, unable to visit. To keep herself busy, she had prepared a small dinner, lighting candles to make the house feel less empty. The warmth of the flickering flames cast comforting shadows across the room, or so she thought. As Evelyn sat down to eat, a peculiar chill filled the air. She glanced toward the window and saw a figure standing in the yard, motionless. It was dressed in dark clothing, its face hidden beneath a hood. Evelyn's heart raced as she quickly locked the doors and closed the curtains, telling herself it was just a trick of the light. But the knocking began soon after. Slow, deliberate, coming from the back door. Evelyn froze, her fork hovering in midair. The knocks grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the house. Gathering her courage, she crept toward the door, her slippers brushing against the cold floor. "Who's there?" she called, her voice shaking. There was no answer, just silence. Then, a whisper, faint but clear, "Let me in." Evelyn's blood turned to ice. She backed away from the door, her breathing ragged. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the whisper came again, this time from the living room. "Let me in." Evelyn turned to see her reflection in the mirror above the fireplace. But it wasn't her reflection. The face staring back at her was pale, hollow-eyed, and grinning. The whispers grew louder, filling the room as the candles extinguished one by one. For Clara, Jake, Amanda, and Evelyn, Thanksgiving had become a night of terror. The warmth and comfort of the holiday were replaced by shadows, whispers, and things that couldn't be explained. Each of them would come to realize that some presences are drawn to the light of celebration, not to join, but to take. And as the night deepened, they found themselves caught in a nightmare they could not escape. Clara sat frozen at the head of the Thanksgiving table, her eyes locked on the empty chair Sophie had pointed to. The room felt like it was holding its breath, every creak of the old farmhouse suddenly amplified in the silence. Her family exchanged nervous glances, trying to dismiss the child's words as innocent imagination, but the tension was palpable. Clara forced a smile and said, "It's getting late. Let's finish dinner." Yet the atmosphere refused to return to normal. As they cleared the table, the house seemed to come alive again. The flickering lights intensified, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Clara's brother, Paul, noticed at first. The antique mirror in the hallway began to fog over, much like it had for Rachel in the other story. But here, it wasn't a single word that appeared. It was an outline, a shape, slowly forming as though drawn by an invisible hand. It resembled the tall figure Sophie had described, its head tilted, its smile unnaturally wide. Paul tried to brush it off, wiping the glass with his sleeve, but the shape wouldn't fade. Instead, it grew clearer, as though etched into the very surface of the mirror. When he turned back to the dining room, the entire family was staring at him, their faces pale. Clara's voice broke the silence. "I think we need to leave." But leaving wasn't so simple. As they gathered their coats, the front door refused to open. The locks turned easily, but the door remained stuck, as if held shut by an unseen force. Paul tried the back door, only to find the same resistance. Panic set in as Clara's mother, Margaret, began praying softly under her breath. Sophie clutched her father's hand tightly, her small voice trembling as she whispered, "He doesn't want us to go." The windows fogged up, just like the mirror, and on every surface, more words began to appear, *stay. Watch. Feast, *. The family huddled together in the living room, their breaths visible in the unnaturally cold air. The whispers started. Again, faint and distant at first, but growing louder, closer, until they were all around them. Jake and Amanda weren't faring any better. The car hadn't moved in what felt like hours, and the fog around them grew so thick that even the headlights seemed swallowed by it. Amanda tried calling her parents, but there was no signal. Jake stepped out of the car to inspect the road, his footsteps crunching on the gravel, but as he moved forward, the path seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees warping into twisted, unnatural shapes. "Jake, get back in the car." Amanda's voice cut through the stillness, sharp with fear. He turned and jogged back, but before he could climb in, a sound stopped him in his tracks, a deep, guttural growl emanating from somewhere in the fog. It was low and resonant, vibrating through the air, growing louder with each passing second. Jake instinctively backed toward the car, his eyes darting around, searching for the source. The growling stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. Then, from the shadows of the trees, a pair of glowing eyes appeared, large, unblinking, and fixed directly on Jake. Amanda screamed, and Jake scrambled into the car, slamming the door just as the growling returned, now accompanied by the sound of heavy, deliberate footsteps circling the vehicle. Inside, the temperature dropped drastically, their breath fogging the windows. Jake turned the ignition, praying for the engine to start. It roared to life, and he floored the gas pedal, the tires spinning before the car finally lurched forward. The fog seemed to part just enough for them to see the road ahead, but the glowing eyes followed, visible in the rearview mirror, their intensity unwavering. As they sped down the road, Amanda noticed something horrifying. The shadows of the trees on either side of the car weren't just stationary, they moved, twisting and contorting, their shapes forming grotesque figures that reached out as if trying to grab the vehicle. "Jake, don't stop," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine's hum. "Just don't stop." Evelyn's night had taken an even darker turn. The whispers in her living room grew louder, more distinct, until they became a cacophony of voices speaking over one another. She backed into the corner, clutching her phone, but every attempt to call for help resulted in static. The mirror above the fireplace continued to reflect that hollow-eyed figure, its grin widening impossibly as if it were feeding on her fear. Suddenly, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening, oppressive, pressing against Evelyn's chest like a weight. Then, from the hallway, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, measured, echoing ominously on the wooden floor. Evelyn's eyes darted toward the hallway entrance, her body frozen in terror. A shadow stretched across the doorway before a figure emerged. It was the same one from the mirror, pale, impossibly tall, and grinning. Its movements were slow and deliberate, as though savoring every moment. Evelyn scrambled to her feet and ran toward the kitchen, her slippers skidding on the floor. She grabbed a knife from the counter, holding it out in front of her, though her hands shook so violently it was almost useless. The figure stopped just outside the kitchen, its grin never wavering. "You invited me," it said, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to echo in her mind. Evelyn shook her head frantically. "No, I didn't. Leave me alone," she screamed. But the figure only tilted its head, as if amused by her desperation. The lights flickered violently before going out completely, plunging the house into darkness. Evelyn could hear it moving, its footsteps echoing closer, the sound of its breathing heavy and labored. She swung the knife blindly, but it connected with nothing but air. The figure's laughter filled the room, a deep, haunting sound that sent chills down her spine. For Clara, Jake, Amanda, and Evelyn, the night was far from over. The entities that had appeared to them weren't fleeting apparitions. They were something far more malevolent, something that thrived on fear and isolation. Each of them was trapped in their own nightmare, with no clear way out. And as the hours stretched on, they began to realize that Thanksgiving, once a symbol of gratitude and family, had become a night of terror that none of them would forget.